Hello everybody, welcome to another video. So this isn't really a topic that I'm relishing talking about because it's not exactly uplifting. But although I've talked about it in a few videos, I haven't made a specific video on the Uyghurs and what's been happening with them in China. And I think the more people who talk about this, the better, really. It gets nowhere near the attention that it really should. So for anyone who's totally in the dark, the Uyghurs are an ethnic population in northwestern China who have been subject to a massive campaign of ethnic repression, internment, and now evidence has come forward that it would be labelled genocide under the UN definition. And finally, although it took a long time, a lot of governments in the West have come forward and denounced this. It's getting a lot more attention in the media, and especially because Disney, for whatever reason, decided to film Mulan in this region and specifically thanked the local government who had been perpetrating this campaign. So there are currently an estimated 2 to 3 million Uyghurs in concentration camps or who have been in concentration camps, along with many other minorities like the Hui Muslims and ethnic Kazakhs, subject to forced labour, forced indoctrination. Many also subjected to organ harvesting, business for political prisoners in China, and torture and sterilisation policies that have led to an 80% drop in the Uyghur population over the last 20 years. And so based on the scale of this, from UN's definition of genocide, this could actually end up being the largest genocide of the 21st century so far. And so I thought it was worth making a video explaining all of this and saying, why is the Chinese government actually doing this? Because I think that's something that often gets lost in the conversation about it. The Uyghurs are a Turkic people who originally settled in Central Asia and later parts of northern China around the 8th century. And they were a political entity known as the Uyghur Khaganate, and they eventually formed part of the Mongols when the Mongols invaded all this area, and later converted to Islam when it was spreading throughout the same region. And throughout Chinese history, there's always been this struggle between the more settled Han ethnic people of the south, who live in the kind of denser jungle rural regions, and the nomadic peoples in the north who come from the steppe, like the Mongols or the Xianbei, the Xiongnu, or the Manchurians. And this is actually not the first time that a genocide has been carried out by a Chinese state in the region. During the Qing dynasty in the 17th century, China was conquered by the northern Manchus, who then turned their attention to conquering all the other northern peoples in the northern Chinese area. And where the Uyghurs were living at the time was part of a group called the Dzungar Khanate, after a group of people called the Dzungars, that lasted nearly 70 years. And finally, the Qianlong Emperor, in the mid-18th century, he decided to finally put an end to the Dzungar rebellion. So he ordered the total annihilation of the Dzungar people. He said that the barbarians had turned their backs on civilization and that heaven supported him in wiping them out. And orders were given to completely exterminate the Dzungar people. Around 600,000 people, it's estimated, were killed. Close to 80% of the population were wiped out, and the rest were forced into slavery by the Qing conquerors, eerily similar to what's happening to the Uyghurs today. Now, this is one of the 19th century's biggest genocides, and it kind of started a historical pattern of the Chinese seeing this western frontier as a subhuman people. They're viewed as the barbarians on the outskirts of the empire who need to be subjugated, or Sinicized as they put it. When the communists took power, they basically continued a long history of repressive policies against the minorities in the region, which had been set down by precedent from earlier empires. But they did this using the specific methods of totalitarianism that were borrowed from the Soviet Union. So the communists under Chairman Mao, they basically copied the Soviet Union system almost wholesale, including how to deal with minority populations. So the Soviets had policies like using famine as a repression tool against populations like the Ukrainians, and they had mass deportation campaigns for the Tatars, the Chechens, the Ingush, the Kazakhs, which killed large percentages of these ethnic populations. And basically this whole system of mass resettlement, mass internment, creating a kind of internalized country within a country was copied by the Chinese communists, and they used them to create these so-called autonomous regions, like Xinjiang, like Tibet, Inner Mongolia, and other regions. And during these Communist Party campaigns, like the anti-rightist campaign, the Great Famine, the Cultural Revolution, there were massive internments of populations like the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, mass torture, mass killing. We don't quite know how bad things were during the famine, but we know that at some point during the 1960s, there were tens of thousands of Uyghurs who tried to escape Xinjiang and cross to the Soviet Union, even after Soviet troops opened fire of live ammunition into the crowd. So they were trying to escape starvation. In the 90s, a lot of tensions flared up in the Xinjiang region because after the fall of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan and states like Kyrgyzstan became independent, and so Xinjiang, who were ethnically Turkic, they also wanted to basically join part of Kazakhstan or form their own independent territory, created this kind of internal nationalist movement. And so the Chinese government pushed a nationalist policy because they were afraid of breaking up in the same way that the Soviet Union did. As part of this nationalist assimilation campaign, they adopted a policy of sort of gradual assimilation. So they believed that by improving economic control of the region and by providing incentives to Han Chinese to settle in the region and start businesses and actually marry ethnic local women, that they would be gradually assimilated into the Chinese people, as had happened to many Chinese populations of the past, like the Hakka and the Miao, who are ethnically distinct but very similar to Chinese because of centuries of interbreeding. And so it's important to understand that the Chinese motivation is one of sort of ethnic assimilation. They look at their past and how populations have been assimilated through interbreeding, and they try and do this to populations like the Uyghurs and Tibetans, except they want to speed it up and do it at a breakneck pace. But in the 2000s, this policy was one that was foreseen as happening over a very long period of time. But in 2008, you had the Beijing Olympics, and that put the spotlight on a lot of human rights groups in China who tried to bring attention to plights of ethnic populations like the Uyghurs and Tibetans. And these protests broke out in 2008 against the Han Chinese. These protests convinced a new generation of nationalist academics in China who were allied with the new political class around Xi Jinping. Specifically an academic called Angang, and he advocates that China should create a quote-unquote state race and abolish individual cultural identity which had been allowed to foster and instead absorb them into the ethnic population of the Han. And so when Xi Jinping took power, as part of this new assimilation policy, a CCP official called Chen Quanguo, he implemented a system in Tibet known as the grid system, where every district of the province for a couple of miles was closed off into these internal grids, which were put up with borders and mass surveillance and an internal passport system, so you had to have specific permission to leave. And he started these thought reform campaigns. And after he'd done that in Tibet in 2013, when ISIS was gaining ground in the Middle East and there was extremist tensions in Xinjiang, he was moved into Xinjiang to perform the same policy to the Uyghurs. But this policy became sort of really extreme around 2014 and 2015 because you had terrorist attacks involving Xinjiang natives, most famously the Kunming train station attacks, where dozens of people armed with knives stabbed dozens of people to death in Kunming in Yunnan, and an explosive vehicle attack in Tiananmen Square. And we know from the leaked documents that came out last year that the China cables that the ICIJ released, that the response to this was led by Xi Jinping himself, the president. He created something called the Strike Hard campaign, where in his speeches he orders to round everyone up as part of an extra-legal campaign. And so anyone who could even be plausibly suspected as harbouring some kind of independent or anti-nationalist sentiment, or even being vaguely influenced by foreign influences outside of China, would be put into these camps and basically indoctrinated and then sentenced to forced labour. And he orders them specifically to show no mercy. Almost the exact same words that the Qianlong Emperor used centuries before. And so in 2016 these camps started to appear. And because anyone was placed in the camps who was suspected of having some kind of foreign influence, it's not just the Uyghurs who were placed in them, although they're the vast majority. Also the Hui Muslims, but ethnic Kyrgyz, ethnic Kazakhs, because they just happen to look Uyghur or, be Muslim and practice the Muslim religion. And so one thing to understand about this campaign is that there's many different types of internment. Many people who are not actually interned are also forced to go and watch indoctrinating videos, watch CCP propaganda, and this is the population that's supposedly free. But the ones who are in the camp properly are made to study Xi Jinping thought, which basically involves all of the party propaganda about loving the party, worshipping the party, economic, socialist development, stuff like that, and basically supporting all of Xi Jinping's economic policies. And this expanded to the point where in 2017 it was estimated about 1 million Uyghurs had been interred. After they go through these internment camps, these indoctrination camps, they then graduate and either go to prison if they're convicted of a crime, because this is separate to the prison system, or they go to a labour camp, which is the vast majority of graduates, so-called. And they're basically sent there as forced labour, mostly to do slave labour in the cotton camps, making clothes, but also making tech products. And in the last few years, the Uyghurs and many others have been shipped all around China to different factories, which makes it very difficult to know where this forced labour is coming from, because they're sent to camps all around the country. And many Western companies have been involved with this supply chain. And so here's a photo of a factory that makes Nike clothes, which has barbed wire and a guard tower by it. And so these slave labour camps, this is what happens if they're lucky. If they're unlucky, they're selected for the PLA hospitals that are run by the army and are in the business of organ harvesting, which is a business that the PLA runs for profit, killing these detainees and selling their organs for profit in other countries like the Middle East. And many doctors in the region have admitted to doing this. This is something that the CCP used against the Falun Gong, a religious group in the late 90s, and have perfected this with the Uyghurs. Now, the Bloody Harvest report that examined organ harvesting in the 2000s estimated that there were close to 70 to 100,000 deaths because of this from organ harvesting around in about 10 years, which is close to 3 to 5% of the population that were imprisoned. Now, if we apply this same figure to the Uyghur population, even if we take a very conservative low estimate, you still get a death toll of around 60 to 90,000 deaths. And that's not even including mass sterilization and deaths from torture and malnutrition, which we know there have been many of from the eyewitness testimonies. So, by some estimates, that would put it as possibly the largest genocide of the 21st century, close to the Sudanese genocide that happened in the early 2000s, and much, much higher than the Yazidi and the Rakhine Myanmar genocide that happened a few years ago. And Muslim countries themselves have been intimidated into silence, as many of them signed into the Belt and Road, and part of the condition of these economic investments is that they stay silent about China's human rights record. And many of these countries have actually extradited Uyghurs living there. Countries like Egypt and Thailand and Turkey have extradited Uyghurs to China to be imprisoned. Uyghurs are being persecuted not just in Xinjiang but all over the world. But we do need to be clear about what this is as a policy. Although it does meet the standards of genocide as outlined by the UN Convention, it's important not to water down the definition of genocide, because a genocide is supposed to be the complete annihilation of a race. And this is not strictly what the CCP is doing, although they would definitely do this if they had to, as Adrian Zenz points out when he talks about this. They're trying to completely abolish Uyghur cultural identity, and they're happy to kill anybody who resists this in the process. And so their goal is to reduce the population so much that the leftover population have no distinctive cultural identity at all, and are put in labour camps and basically have no memory of anything of what it meant to be a Uyghur or what it meant to be an ethnic Kazakh or a Kyrgyz in that region. There are cases where children, both of their parents are sent to the camps, and the children are sent to these little angel kindergartens, where children sometimes only a few months old are sent to these basically indoctrination camps, and then sent to elementary, middle and high schools, which are all complete boarding schools where the children all live at the school and never leave. So the Uyghurs are now, many of them are completely raised by the state from cradle to grave, which is a complete slave existence, a transformation of entire people into a race of slaves, just as Hitler wanted to do with the populations of Eastern Europe. And the supposedly free citizens of Xinjiang are hardly better off. They're constantly under mass surveillance, traced at all times. There's a giant data center called the Joint Operations Command, which analyzes their internet communication. So if they look at the wrong video or post online, then this will send them to the camp. Kind of like a YouTube or a Google algorithm, except that instead of recommending products, it is sending you to a concentration camp. And of course, all of this is run by Chinese tech companies like ByteDance that owns TikTok, and Huawei and iFlyTech and all the rest. And you also have these campaigns like allowing Han police to live in the homes of Uyghur women, to forcibly marry Uyghur women, and to demolish any traditional houses and buildings of the Uyghurs, including their mosques, their graveyards, and their traditional architecture. Most of this is centered around Turpan, the area where the Uyghur populations are highest. And I would say that apart from the US in the world, there has been almost no action until recently to actually do something about this. The US has recently imposed Magnitsky Sanctions against companies and individuals involved. A few days ago, they imposed a massive import block on the entire region, which is a great development. And recently, countries like France and the UK have started to denounce this, but have actually done very little in terms of policy, which is completely shameful. There should be a complete ban on exports from a region by Europe and basically any democracy that believes in human rights. Because there's not going to be any change unless you actually make the economic incentive to do this go away. And I want to finally say something about the giant misinformation propaganda campaign that China is conducting on any corner of the internet. Whenever you mention this, there'll be a complete host of online deniers from China. And you just have to say to these people, do you believe the Holocaust happened? Do you believe that any genocide in history happened? Because we have so much evidence for this. We have more evidence for this than we did for the Holocaust. We have leaked party documents, statistics ordering the campaigns, photos of the camps themselves, officials admitting on camera what they were doing, and hundreds and hundreds of eyewitnesses by now. So this is more evidence than practically any genocide in history. And finally, there's an argument that I used to encounter, although not so much anymore, that China is just, they're just realists. They're just doing what is necessary to crack down on terrorism in the region, and that this is what you have to do to get rid of Muslim terrorists. But this is complete nonsense, because this is not at all about terrorism. It's about abolishing an ethnicity. If they actually wanted to combat terrorism, you can just look at a country like neighbouring Kazakhstan, which is right next to Xinjiang. Look at what they did. I mean, they're not by any means a liberal country, or a democratic country, really. But they had a much worse terrorism population than Xinjiang. But what they did is they worked with international anti-terrorist groups, and they started to become very harsh on extremists, and crack down on them a lot, but were very conciliatory towards moderates, and they haven't had a single terrorist attack since 2017, and yet they managed to do this without imprisoning 10% of their population. Kazakhstan, by the way, actually has a much higher standard of living than people do in Xinjiang, even if you include the much wealthier Han population. And so please try and raise awareness about this. Don't buy from Chinese companies. I know it's difficult, but try not to. Support Uyghur organizations, write to local officials, and go to a protest about this near you if you can. And so I think it's shameful that so much of the world is silent on this, because we won't be able to say that we didn't know this was happening. And some more people have to start speaking up about it. So hopefully things will change soon, but we can only hope. So thank you for listening.